There it is.
I got it.
Yes, thank you. All right, everyone. Well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. We should have a packed Zoom room, so to speak. My name is Christine Williams, and I, along with my colleague Sally Greenspan, are looking forward to talking to all of you today about the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. So you'll hear me refer to it interchangeably as AHSC or AHSC. There's a lot of acronym soup going on. I just wanted to preface with that. And just to kind of get a feel for who's in the Zoom room today with us, if you don't mind just putting your name, affiliation, if you have one, and whether you've worked on an AHSC application before in the chat. We'd love to just learn a little bit more about who's here with us today. So this is a 101, and we are going to be covering a lot of material. If you are familiar with the program, you know there's a lot to dig through. So we will be sharing out these presentation slides after today's conversation, and the Strategic Growth Council will also eventually have this recording posted on their YouTube site. So we will include a link to that as well following the presentation today. If you do have questions, we have time set aside at the end to review those with you. You are also welcome to put your questions directly into the chat. We do have some enterprise staff on hand who will work to respond to those live if we can. And then finally, before we get going here, I just want to extend our thanks to the Strategic Growth Council, which is sponsoring our entire summer AHSC webinar series. So we do have a variety of other AHSC related webinars coming up, and we'll be sharing out the dates for those topics towards the end of today's conversation. All right, let's get into it. We'll start with kind of a quick intro to enterprise and then dig into a program overview coming up. But if you aren't familiar with our team, Enterprise Community Partners, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to all things affordable housing. So in regards to the AHSC program, Enterprise has really been involved since the inception over a decade ago. And we've been providing technical assistance since round one. So very deeply embedded within this particular program. Enterprise has a team of technical assistance staff across the state. So myself, for example, I am based in Stockton, and we really focus on tailoring our TA in context appropriate ways based on the community you're working in. We also have members of other organizations who participate on our TA team and deliver specific expertise. So we have a rural TA providers focused on climate resilience, as well as greenhouse gas reduction quantification. So a lot of breadth and also depth. All right, let's move into kind of some background on the AHSC program. All right, so this is a slide that kind of covers, again, some like the origin story of AHSC, right? And I really find that with this particular program, you tend to do better if you understand how the program originated and ultimately what its fundamental goals are. So AHSC is one of many California cap and trade programs, what we refer to or has been referred to as different climate investment programs. And AHSC receives its revenue from quarterly cap and trade auctions where pollution allowances are purchased. And the revenue generated from those purchases are funneled into a variety of climate investment programs, including AHSC. And I think it's important to have this background because at its core, AHSC is ultimately a greenhouse gas reduction program. So it funds projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that reduction comes from pairing affordable housing specifically with a variety of different sustainable transportation projects to help provide alternatives to folks needing to use their car to get around, thereby reducing vehicle miles traveled. And I find if you keep this greenhouse gas reduction goal sort of as your guiding light, you can have an easier time sort of putting together, you know, a full application package that includes scope that's going to achieve that goal. All right, so I mentioned that the program has been around since formally launching in 2014. We are entering the 9th round of the AHSC program. And this slide really shows, I think, the scale of investment. So AHSC, it's a big program, right? And to date, over $3 billion has been awarded for projects across California that integrate housing, transit, and active transportation scope. And that $3 billion has resulted in almost 18,000 new affordable homes for folks across California, and resulted in the avoidance of over 5 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So pretty big impact. And then you can see round to round, the funding pot has remained fairly large, but it can fluctuate a bit. And we've also seen some changes in the award maximums that any individual application can pursue. So in round 8, we just finished round 9, but in the most final round to date, we saw a funding pot available of $675 million, with individual applications able to secure up to $50 million per award. So a fairly significant investment. All right, so mentioned that the primary goal of this program is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through, mode shift, getting people to use different modes of transportation. But AHSC is also a program about connections. So how are we connecting housing to jobs and other key destinations through those sustainable transportation options, transit, walking, biking? AHSC is also a program that looks to direct funding into disadvantaged communities across the state, and thereby maximizing a variety of different outcomes around the economy, the environment, and public health, what the program refers to as different co-benefits. And these are really all part of, I think, what makes this program very unique, right? So we like to say, if you know anyone on our team, you might have heard this, AHSC really incentivizes looking beyond the parcel. So seeing how you can extend all of these different co-benefits beyond just a single housing site to really enhance a neighborhood. AHSC is also very unique in that it really incentivizes cross-sector partnerships. And you need those partnerships to have a successful project. And that's something we really stress and can work with you on facilitating these relationships. So every partner has something that they can contribute in a beneficial way to an application. So this slide sort of highlights sort of the traditional entities that are involved in any single application, right? Your community-based organizations, your housing developer, transit agencies, and then public agency partners. Okay, breaking down those partnerships a little more and sort of connecting them to some of the language the program uses. So again, we've bucketed, the primary entities you would be working with on an AHSC application into the different scoping buckets that AHSC uses. So if you're looking at housing, again, that's typically going to be initiated and led by a housing developer, and funding is broken out into 2 different categories related to housing. And so we'll review some examples on an upcoming slide, but we have the affordable housing development and housing related infrastructure sort of make up the bulk of the housing costs in any given application. Next, we have the two sort of transportation capital scope categories. So that's STI, for Sustainable Transportation Infrastructure, and TRA, Transportation Related Amenities. Again, we'll get into some specific examples, but these are scoping elements that are typically, not always, but typically going to be managed by a public agency partner. So your city public works department, your local transportation agency or authority, your county partners. So it is important to engage with one another early and to start these conversations. And then we have the PGM or program category. So there are a variety of different programming costs that AHSC will fund and some that it requires. And all of these are bucketed under this PGM category. This category is a little more flexible in terms of what type of entity would be managing this. It's usually a variety of different folks. And again, we'll break down examples of these costs in an upcoming slide. Okay, as you may have noticed on the prior slide, the AHSC program funds capital projects through either loans or grant funding. So funding for the affordable housing development, specifically rental affordable housing development, is provided as a loan, and it is structured consistent with other HCD housing and community development funding sources. So if you're familiar with how that department manages its loan products, the AHSC program should be familiar. If all other costs are provided in the form of a reimbursable grant. The one caveat I want to call out here is that if you are pursuing a home ownership housing project, that funding is not delivered in the form of a loan. It is also delivered in the form of a grant consistent with the state Cal Home program. And if you have more specific questions on some of these items, we're happy to connect. Okay, so getting into some of these examples of how all the scope can fit into these different cost categories. So again, AHD, affordable housing development costs, include your typical bricks and mortar costs for a housing development, and you can fund, the program will fund a variety of different development types. So new construction for rental and or home ownership projects is eligible. AHSC will also fund property conversions as long as you are converting that property to affordable housing. Rehabilitation projects are also eligible. And then that second housing category, HRI, or housing related infrastructure, includes any scope that is being required specifically as a condition of approval for the affordable housing development. So kind of traditionally, we've seen things like sewer, water, other utility upgrades, but it can really be any cost as long as it is noted as a condition of approval. And as of last round 8, costs associated with factory built housing would also be eligible under this HRI category. All right, STI, Sustainable Transportation Infrastructure. So eligible costs in this category include active transportation improvements, so bike, pedestrian improvements, as well as new public transit improvements. And so for many applicants, this funding category can help implement things you might find in a bike or an active transportation plan, in the mobility element of your general plan. Those can all be really great places to start to try to identify different STI scope. And you can also use AHSC. Again, it doesn't just have to be sort of new infrastructure, but you can improve, for example, existing classifications of bike lanes, if that's a need in your community. And then again, transit partners can also utilize the AHSC program for a variety of different scoping elements. You can procure electric transit vehicles or zero emission transit vehicles. You can build out capital improvements. We've seen a lot of station area upgrades funded through AHSC. You can also pay for a limited time for transit operations if you have a newly expanded line. So again, these are costs typically managed and identified by your local public agencies and transit authorities. TRA, transportation related amenities. So I like to describe the distinction between STI and TRA. STI is sort of the direct infrastructure that you would use as an alternative to a car. And TRA items are things that make you want to use that STI project, right? So this is a fairly broad category. It can include different streetscape improvements. So street lighting, right? You don't want to build a pedestrian sidewalk and not have lighting. Urban greening costs typically fall into the TRA bucket. Street signage and furniture, bike repair kiosks we've seen, bike parking. Transit agencies, again, have also requested AHSC funds to build different amenities around their station areas, different stop improvements. One thing to note is that between prior STI and this TRA category, applications are capped at 10 million, or excuse me, I think that's been 15 million for the STI and TRA ask. So you just want to keep that cap in mind as you're putting scoping elements on the table, that you're working within that 15 million cap. All right. I know it's been a lot of information. Again, the slides will go out. We've got more coming, but just want to recognize that there's a lot of items on this program slide, right? But these are all examples of things that can go under that PGM category. And there are point incentives tied to certain programming scopes. So each application will be utilizing this category. For example, for both anti-displacement and some more general programming, AHSC requires a minimum of $150,000 within each of those categories. And additionally, if you're going to use AHSC to fund any workforce development programming, those costs would also go under this PGM category. Costs for some threshold items, specifically transit passes and the provision of internet, must also be put under the program category. And then similar to the STI and TRA scope, there is a budget maximum. So you cannot exceed $600,000 within this category. And you might be like, wow, Christine, there's like 7 different things on that slide. I've already hit $600,000. There is a caveat, right? So transit passes, which can be, depending on the size of your development, can be a fairly large budget item. The cost of transit passes is excluded from that $600,000 cap. So, you want to just, again, be mindful as you're putting things together of how they fit within that budget maximum. And now I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Sally, to talk to you a bit about different threshold considerations and things to keep in mind as it relates to this program. So Sally, I will bump it over to you and just let me know when you need me to advance the slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. I'm Sally Greenspan. I'm a senior director based in our San Francisco office and a part of our AHSC TA team here. Next slide. So we're going to start off with one of the important threshold requirements that all AHSC applications have a qualifying transit stop within a half-mile walking distance from the affordable housing parcel. This is a distance that is measured as a walking distance, as opposed to some other distances that we'll speak about later. So you will need to make sure that there is a walkable route in place from your housing site to a qualifying transit stop or station. Qualifying transit station or stop is a defined term in the guidelines. We haven't put it up here because there's already so much to share with you today. But essentially it means a transit stop that is served by transit at least 2 times in the same direction during peak hours. So that is a relatively low bar to reach. That is intentional because the state wants to make this program available broadly, but they also want to make sure that the folks in these housing locations will have access to public transportation. So we do typically find that most projects do not have any trouble reaching this particular threshold requirement. The exception is occasionally there is a housing location that does not have sidewalks in place at the time of application. And that is great because you can actually use your AHSC dollars to create the walkable route. So you could use those AHSC dollars to create that pedestrian access route. And it just has to be complete by the time your housing receives its certificate of occupancy. The other scenario where this can occasionally be a problem is if your project is in a not very transit-rich location. That usually occurs when we're looking at RIPA projects. And so there is an exception to this threshold requirement or some flexibility wherein ICP and TOD projects have to have that qualifying transit in place at the time of application submittal. However, RIPAs can use their AHSC dollars to fund the qualifying transit, and in that case, it must be in place by the date of certificate of occupancy again. I want to mention a common misconception. The qualifying transit does not have to be part of your STI funded project. You do not have to use AHSC dollars on that qualifying transit. Your AHSC funding might be used for a different transit project that is not the same transit as at that stop. So those are sort of decoupled. Next slide, please. So this slide is about the project area formation, which is both a threshold and a scoring consideration and a scoping consideration. But we wanted to put it here because it's very easy to get mixed up between the measurement of the half-mile walking distance to the qualifying transit that we just went over, and this distance, which is the 1 mile as the crow flies radius on your housing site. And this is a really critical measurement because it creates the area in which you can find and put together your AHSC application scope. So one of the first things you'll want to do when looking into an AHSC application is draw that 1 mile radius on your housing location and start to look for what kinds of STI and TRA projects are located within that area. As I mentioned, this is as the crow flies. There's some online free tools that you can use to draw these radii. The center of the radius can be any place on your AHD parcel, and you can electively select that place. Often it doesn't really matter which exact part on the parcel you choose, but once in a while, if there's something in particular you're trying to reach that's very close to the 1 mile radius, you might want to try to scoot the center of the radius over in that direction. It's important to remember that the STA projects may extend beyond the 1 mile radius, but an entrance or the beginning of the pedestrian and bicycle project must be within the 1 mile radius, but it can extend beyond. And similarly, with a transit improvement project, an entrance to that transit service, a transit stop where someone can board that transit service must be located within the project area. And for TRA projects, they must be entirely inside the project area. Next slide. So another important threshold consideration is your project area type. AHSC has 3 different bucket or competitive categories within which a project will compete. The distinction between the 3 categories largely has to do with what kind of transit is near the housing. So if you have high quality transit within that half-mile walking route, you will be a TOD project. High quality transit is also a defined term in the guidelines. It essentially refers to transit that has 15-minute or less headways and operates on a fixed route, such as rail or a bus-only lane. 35% of the total AHSC dollars in any year are devoted to TOD projects, and those projects will compete against themselves. And there is a 30 unit per acre minimum density for those projects. The second category is ICP, or Integrated Connectivity Project. These are projects that do not have high quality transit within that half-mile walking distance. You must, of course, have qualifying transit within the half-mile walking distance, but if you do not have high quality transit, then you will compete in this category. 35% of the total funds in a given year are set aside here as well, and 20 units per acre is the minimum density. I will just note that because of the service cuts to transit in many transit agencies across the state due to COVID and the sort of decline in transit ridership that occurred, many projects that would previously have been TODs are now actually in the ICP category. So right now, the ICP category is rather large, at least in the most recent round, and we'll see how, as transit agencies adjust their service, how that winds up looking as we go forward. And then the last category is the RIPA category, the Rural Innovation Project Area. And this category is defined not by the type of transit that you're located near, but rather whether your project is in a rural area. Rural area is also a technical term here, and there are a couple of different ways to be defined as rural. You can work with us, follow up with us separately, or attend our upcoming rural webinar, where we'll go into more detail into what qualifies as a RIPA project. 10% of the total dollars are set aside for this funding category, and 15 units per acre is the minimum density. Just mention that you'll probably notice that 35 plus 35 plus 10 does not equal 100. There is an additional, whoops, Christine, thanks. There is an additional 20% of funding that's set aside to meet, other council priorities, or just goes to the highest scoring projects across all categories. All right, we can advance, please. So there are many, many other threshold considerations. We are highlighting just some of the most major ones here that tend to be notable. Other than the minimum densities that we just discussed on the project area type slide, some others include site control. Must have complete demonstratable site control at the time of application. You must meet developer experience requirements, which can be somewhat tricky, especially for newer developers or developers who are doing projects that are significantly larger than any projects that they have completed before. So if you have any doubts on this item, you should definitely make sure you're going to meet the developer experience requirement, because that has been a pitfall for some recently. You do need to have all discretionary land use approvals in hand at the time of application, another critical threshold that can sometimes be difficult, and all environmental clearances for the housing. Side note, the STI and TRA components are exempt from the environmental clearance requirement to date, which is really critical because often those clearances do not come in until a little later. Another few that are kind of specific to AHSC includes the all-electric construction requirement. This means there can be no gas hookups in the building, even for your commercial spaces. That was, for a few years, somewhat challenging for some developers. Right now, we're hearing most are able to reach this all-electric benchmark as we, as a sector, become more friendly to decarbonization. 3 years of free Wi-Fi in all units and all common areas are required. That can be funded, as Christine mentioned, through your program budget. And you are required to include 1 secure indoor bike parking space per 2 units. As I mentioned, there are many, many other threshold requirements, and we encourage you to check the guidelines or a threshold checklist before proceeding. Next slide. Performance threshold. So this is about actually building out and implementing your project. The first key threshold here is that you may not have started construction on any component of your AHSC application by the date of application. This is really quite critical. This means anything from setting up a construction fence to putting shovels in the ground that will disqualify that component of your application. On the flip side, you have a 5-year completion period for all AHSC-funded capital components, which starts at the date of award. We really encourage you to make sure, as you're putting together your application, that you can meet that deadline. It becomes very problematic when project components cannot meet that deadline. There is a provision in the guidelines for 1-year extensions, but those are discretionary, and it's really much better if you are just confident that the scope of your application can be completed within that time frame, including not just the housing, of course, but all of your transportation elements. And the last thing we want to highlight here, which is both an application requirement and performance requirement, is when you apply, the public partners that are completing the non-housing elements of your application, you will need to have some sort of agreement in place with them at the time of application. And those agreements are often strengthened post-award. And these are commitments from the non-applicants that they will build essentially the components of the application that you are submitting that are not the responsibility of the applicants themselves. The other thing just worth mentioning here is that authorizing resolutions, which used to be required as part of the application, are no longer required with your submittal, but will be necessary for the standard agreement. I think we can go to the next slide. So there are a number of specific requirements related to home ownership projects. Home ownership is an eligible project type under AHSC, although it is relatively uncommon. So they've made some special provisions in an attempt to make AHSC work for home ownership. 20% of all of the home ownership units must be affordable units. Scattered sites must have a single owner at the time of the AHSC grant agreement. And AHSC funds are distributed as a grant for the housing component as opposed to a loan for a rental project. And those grants follow the Cal Home guidelines and are dispersed on a reimbursement progress basis. All restricted units obviously must be made available to first-time home buyers. And other than that, home ownership projects are subject to all other threshold requirements. If you are considering a home ownership project for AHSC, we definitely encourage you to learn more about it, as it can be somewhat complicated. And we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions on that, or we can spend some time at the end of this webinar answering questions. Next slide. Okay, so moving into some of the scoring and best practices. So this is a sample funds requested budget, and it is broken down, as you can see, into these categories that we've been discussing. The housing category, which is the combined AHD HRI request. In this case, 35 million. Actually, Christine, do you mind advancing the other pieces of this slide? I know it's going to be a lot for people to see it all at once, but great. So the 35 million is the maximum request that you can make for housing in this program. So for all the housing developers out there today, 35 million is the most you will be able to get out of any one given AHSC application for your housing project. Additionally, the housing request must be 50% or greater of your total AHSC request. That is not usually a problem. It's typical for the housing request to be more in the 2/3 or 3/4 proportion of the total request. Then we come to the two transportation buckets, STI and TRA. There is a maximum combined STI TRA request of 15 million, as Christine mentioned earlier, and those dollars have to be shared across all of your transportation partners. So if you have your city and your transit agency involved, this budget is really split between them and any other transportation partners. There are some points considerations here to keep in mind, and we'll get into this a little more later. There are some points that will be awarded for spending at least 7.5 million or 25%, whatever is less, on STI, and spending at least 1.5 million or 5%, whichever is less, on the TRA component. And then last of all, the program request, Christine also mentioned, the cap is 600,000 excluding the transit pass request. So the total award request maximum is 50 million. And just to look at this sample here a little bit more before we move on, this is a pretty typical AHSC request budget overall. This particular budget, this project maximized their housing request. That is pretty typical, but by no means all applications ask for the maximum housing amount. This particular example here went a little bit above and beyond in the STI bucket over the 7.5 million that you really need to minimum that you need to meet for points. This probably is because they had some transit components they couldn't quite squeeze into the 7.5 million. They went with the kind of classical 1.5 million TRA, and then as you can see, the program budget is pretty close to the 600,000 maximum, which is typical because there are so many programmatic elements you want to squeeze in order to earn all the program points. And so the total request was around 46 million. That tends to be a little bit on the higher side for an AHSC request, but definitely within the realm of the typical. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, but you really, as you're putting together your AHSC budget, you are really going to want to take into consideration balancing all these different factors and making sure that you don't violate any of the threshold requirements. I think we can move on. So just one more slide on this to reiterate a couple of key points. The maximum loan amount of 35 million is sized based on the MHP loan limits. And many of the developers out there will be very familiar with those, but in case you are not, there's essentially a chart that the state publishes, and for a given unit size, location, and AMI level, there are kind of fluctuating tiered loan limits. So in order to size your housing request, you'll need to look at that chart and figure out your total maximum loan requests that you can make based on those per unit limits. We already mentioned these transportation allocations based on the desire to maximize your point score at the 7.5 million and 1.5 million level. And then one last consideration that is worth considering is that overall, it is better to have a lower dollar request because that will maximize your GHG efficiency score. However, you have to balance that with the need to ask for the funding that you need to complete your project, and the fact that many of the things that you will want to add to your AHSC scope and add to your budget will help you earn other points. So it's really a balancing act of trying to, put together a budget that meets the needs of your project, scores as high as you can in other areas, while keeping the overall request as low as you can in order to get the highest GHG efficiency score. And it's often an iterative process to get to the final budget. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to whip through this relatively quickly so that we can have hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. There are 3 buckets of scoring. The first bucket is the GHG scoring section. This is 30 points out of the total 100 points. Within this bucket, it is further divided into 3 subcategories. GHG transit and shared mobility, which is really your transit component in any shared mobility like a scooter or bike share program. That's worth 5 points. GHG project area includes all of the housing GHGs, the solar GHGs, and the active transportation, aka bike ped GHGs, for 10 points. And then GHG efficiency score is the total GHGs in both of the first 2 categories divided by your total AHSC request. We are going to have an entire webinar. It's our next webinar on July 24th about this subject, but I just think it's critical to mention, in case you can't attend that one, that the GHG score is by far the most important part of the application. It's the most total points for a single policy goal, but it is also the points that are the hardest to get and where there tends to be the greatest spread. GHG score is scored on a binning system, which is essentially scoring on a curve. So it creates a spread of points that we don't see in other parts of the application. So this is really where applications are often won or lost. It's certainly not the only thing that matters, but it can have a very big influence on your likelihood of award. And within this category, in case you had not heard, the transit component is the most influential component of your GHG score. And this is because many of the other GHG quantification elements, like the housing or the active transportation, tends to result in relatively low GHG reductions, but the transit component can deliver very large GHG reductions. And so, it is the projects that have those large transit GHG scores that tend to dominate the competition. So one of the first things that applicants will want to do is to explore their transit GHG project availability with their local partners. Next slide. These are the second bucket of scores, the quantitative policy scoring bucket. There are so many different elements of this. I will run through them very quickly at a high level. Active transportation and transit improvements, 15 points for your bike ped scope, and for essentially local bus components like bus stops, bus only lanes, things of that nature. This category is very important as well, and you'll want to work with your local city, local jurisdiction, and local transit provider on these points very early on. Green building and renewable energy is for reaching certain thresholds on a variety of different green building scoring criteria like LEED and other green buildings programs. Housing and transportation collaboration has to do with how many dollars you're spending in the STI and TRA section, as well as other things like whether you happen to be near a high-speed rail, whether you are building on public land, things of that nature for 10 points. So there's some really important points to pick up there. Location efficiency and access to destinations is regarding what kinds of key destinations are within the 1 mile radius. So projects that are in more amenity-rich areas will score higher here. Funds committed is a 4-point winner-take-all category where if your project can demonstrate that it is fully committed, all funding is committed at the date of application, you will receive 4 points. If even a single dollar is not committed, you get 0 points in this section. The AHSC request, and the anticipated tax credit commitments are considered committed at the date of application. So you can count those as committed. Any other discretionary funding you would need to have in hand in order to earn these points. Pro-housing designation, 2 points for having your jurisdiction that your housing is located in, your application is located in. If it has received its pro-housing designation, you'll receive 2 extra points. So a lot of applicants have been working really hard with their cities to get these designations in place. And then there's 3 program categories I'm just going to kind of lump together: the anti-displacement activities, the local workforce development and hiring practices section, and the programs section. These are all points that you can earn for partnering with certain organizations, setting up those partnerships, and allocating funding to those programmatic elements. So really encourage you to start early on developing those programmatic partnerships so you can earn those points. And last of all, housing affordability, 5 points for reaching certain affordability thresholds, and also large unit sizes for a couple points there. Next slide. And then narrative-based policy, this is an additional 18 points that are rewarded for having substantive community engagement and responsiveness, including climate adaptation and resiliency measures in your project, engaging in really extensive collaboration and planning with your local partners, and including components and approaches to your project that demonstrate a significant commitment to advancing equity and sort of exceeding even the ambitious goals of the AHSC program in terms of transformative impact. This section I will just conclude by saying it is often a section that is left till the last moment, but if you can invest some time early on in looking into these sections and thinking about things that you can do or prepare to then talk about and discuss in your narrative, the narrative is scored not on the beauty of your prose, but rather on the substantiveness of what you describe in it, of what you are actually doing. And so if you can invest some time in this early on, it does benefit you greatly when you go to write this narrative and then ultimately get scored on this section. Next slide. Okay, so that concludes our scoring section. We're going to move into case studies. I will take the first case study and then I'll hand it off to Christine for the second 2. So this slide is about a TOD project. The project we're highlighting is the 797 South Almaden project by Resources for Community Development up here in the East Bay. This project's main components included a housing component with 98 units of deeply affordable housing for individuals and families, a complete streets project that I'll speak more about on the second slide, which had bike, ped, and transit components, and then a suite of programmatic elements, including transit pass purchase, free Wi-Fi, and partnerships with abode services for the tenant services, South Bay Community Land Trust for the anti-displacement component, and Center for Employment Training for the workforce development element. All in all, this project had a total AHSC request of $29.5 million, broken out as you can see there below. This is a relatively low request for a TOD project, although certainly within the realm of what is typical. And that is one of the many elements that helps them be competitive, was that relatively, efficient request. Next slide. I think it's helpful to just highlight a little bit more about what their transportation components were, since that tends to be one of the most challenging parts for an affordable housing developer to develop that transit scope. So this project included something called the Monterey Corridor Project, which was designed by the city of San Jose in partnership with VTA, the local transit agency in this area, with the aim of improving transit speed and reliability and safety on one of the city's most dangerous corridors. This is a really interesting project. Often an AHSC application will include a bike project, a separate pedestrian project, and a separate transit project. That is totally kosher. But this particular application happened to include a kind of all-in-one project, what we call a complete streets project that had bike, pedestrian, and transit elements all together in essentially one capital project. And that capital project included 12.5 miles of dedicated bus priority lanes, almost 13 miles of class 4 protected bike lanes, and a host of different pedestrian enhancements to help people walk safely in this area. So really great project that was just awarded in the latest round. And that was the TOD project. So to give some ICP and RIPA project examples, I'm going to hand it back over to Christine.
Thanks, Sally. Okay, you'll notice some common themes. So this was round 7 project funded out of Modesto through Visionary Home Builders, included just under 80 units of affordable housing. Speaking to that transformative transit element, this site is within a mile of a rail station that serves the ACE service line that runs into the Bay Area. So they were able to use AHSC dollars to fund a conversion of a locomotive to a zero emission variety, and that really bumped their GHG score. They enhanced their existing downtown bike network, so upgraded some existing lanes to class 2 that connected to other previously funded AHSC bike infrastructure. Something cool I think they did is their community space is going to be open to the public as a cooling center with some energy backup in case the power goes out. If you're in the Central Valley today, you know, at least where I'm at, it's going to be up to 111. And so having cooling centers available far and wide is an important community amenity. They also dedicated $150,000 to a local community-based organization that was interested in pursuing a community land trust assessment. So some innovative program scoping there, and you can see their request for all of these items, just over $33 million. For a rural perspective, we're showcasing a site up in Eureka that was funded, again, in round 7. Link Housing was the affordable housing developer. This is an interesting project because it was a scattered site project, and it focused very heavily on 3 different sites in the downtown area, really looking at community connection. So they worked with Humboldt Transit Authority to launch a microtransit program that's fairly innovative, similar to the project Sally highlighted, funded a community plan around kind of a complete street bike boulevard project. That says train installation, but that Copper Gulch is actually a trail. So it had been identified in a lot of community planning, and they were able to get a portion of that funded through AHSC. Again, around $30 million for all of these scoping elements up in Eureka. Okay, we are going to have a little time for Q&A. I'm going to go through some wrap-up slides very quickly so we can get to that. Again, threshold assessment is sort of the first step. This isn't a program where you need the full 100 points to win. So just keep that in mind. Not everyone is getting every point. We emphasize the GHG score and the importance of kind of the non-housing scope as competitive elements. And I will also talk about how you can engage us for technical assistance through the state, should you be interested. In terms of timing, we are currently anticipating, similar to prior rounds, NOFA will open up at the beginning of 2025 in January, with kind of the fall being a guideline revision period, and applications being due in spring of next year, with awards coming, typically they've come in August of that same year. So it's really important, I think, right now, if you are interested, to be engaging your partners, put some scope on the table, have some conversations about what could be funded. So we encourage you to do that sooner rather than later. We'll drop a link in. We do, as was mentioned, have some upcoming workshops. These are the topics: CGs, active transportation transit, a rural and tribal workshop, and one focused on appropriate engagement. We will also drop into the chat a link for an intake survey that SGC will use to determine if you might be eligible for free technical assistance services. So encourage you to get a project or some ideas into that survey link. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. All right, and that sort of concludes a lot of information on this program. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I've not been able to view the chat, so I'm not sure. We have some unanswered questions in there, but we can open it up. Let me just make sure folks can come off mute if you do want to spend some time with us. And I can stay on a bit after 11 if folks would like to talk one-on-one.
I think we are good in the chat. So thanks to Alejandro and Marlene for answering those questions there. I can also stay on. Do you think we should end the recording? We'll be posting this.
Sure.